I think what we're seeing with this election is that, and it's worth pointing out that a lot of people still aren't paying as much attention as they're going to be even in the last week. So there is that. But I think for a lot of people, what's happening is that they were willing to give Rishi Sunak a chance. And I'm talking about historical Conservative voters here. They were willing to perhaps consider him, although they hadn't made their mind up. But then when they saw a succession of mistakes from Rishi Sunak, most obviously at the start, the coming home from D-Day, I think things like that just help to reinforce the problems. And then as you go along, we then have the issues around betting.
Your latest polls, what are they telling us?
Our latest polls are essentially showing what the polls showed the last time we spoke, and the time before that, and the time at the start of the election.
Are you wondering whether you've been wasting your time? Or...
On the contrary, you see, if they had changed,
right,
that would have been interesting too.
Yes.
What we're interested in, whatever the finding is, the Conservatives are on 21 points. That's down 2. Labour on 42. That's down 3. Both within the margin of error. Liberal Democrats are up 1. Reform are up 4 to 16 points. And we perhaps discuss that in more detail. Then we have the SNP on 3, Green on 4, and others on 2. So were that replicated at a general election, that would be enough for a strong Labour victory, much as it had been at the start of the campaign, much as it had been at the start of the year.
I mean, is this in itself... all joking aside about sort of wasting your time, but is this in itself a really interesting point that after 6 weeks of campaigning, there's been very little difference? We're going to talk about reform in a second, of course, because that is a very important point. But when it comes to the difference between Conservatives and Labour, the gap stayed pretty much the same.
Exactly. When it comes to the two...
Are you surprised by that?
I am surprised. When it comes to the two main parties... the story has remained largely unchanged, and generally speaking, campaigns don't make much difference to the overall result.
But everybody's talked about a narrowing on the polls the closer you get to polling day.
And that's what I was going to say. Although the overall result historically doesn't tend to change, you do tend, again, to get a contraction. You see large leads, whether they are Conservative or Labour, decline as people make up their mind. I think the interesting dynamic in this particular campaign is that while most parties have remained the same, it is reform that has really started to surge throughout the campaign.
So let's talk about reform then. Why have we seen that surge from reform? And more importantly, I guess, for Labour and the Conservatives, is who's suffering the most from their rise in the polls?
Well, in answer to who's suffering the most, it's definitely the Conservatives. But that doesn't mean that if reform weren't running in this election, the Conservatives would pick up 16% of the votes, for instance.
Right.
It simply doesn't work like that. And reform, with the Brexit Party and UKIP before it, have always been very good in mopping up votes of the disenchanted, the disenfranchised, the distrusting, the disapproving. They didn't create this wave, but they've always been very good at riding it into the beach. And this time around, the publicity surrounding Nigel Farage's announcement that he was becoming leader, but also that he was running in Clacton, helped to really focus the minds early on in the campaign. And they got the kind of publicity that, with the best will in the world, Richard Tice running in a particular constituency simply would not have attracted.
Have they suffered at all? I don't know when you did your latest polling, but have Reform suffered at all with the latest string of allegations? Yesterday they had to dispel with 3 candidates after they were found to have posted some very unattractive things on social media. Of course, we had the Channel 4 Dispatches programme and the revelations in there. Has that affected them in the polls at all?
Well, it's too early to say for that particular issue, but we did poll on Reform's previous issue around Vladimir,
yes,
Nigel Farage's comments on Vladimir Putin, and we found that a plurality of people, it actually didn't change their views of Reform. But among Reform supporters, a third said it actually improved their view.
Right, they agreed with it.
Yeah,
even
well,
more.
not yet, exactly. They were more favourable towards it, and so I think that's indicative of the type of behaviour that we see around these things.
And just before we look at some other details of your polling, this idea that the polls haven't tightened between Conservatives and Labour, what do we think that we put that down to the fact that people had pretty much already made up their minds when that election has been called. So therefore, whatever the Conservatives were going to say in the campaign period or offer up would have made very little difference. Or some other people would argue that there is very little difference between what the Conservatives have to offer and Labour have to offer. Some people are saying all that Labour are doing is, well, we're going to do what the Conservatives did, but we're going to do it a bit better.
Yeah, I mean, historically, between a third and around 40% of people say that they make up their mind during the election campaign. And that will tend to be weighted more towards the end of the campaign than the beginning. But when people hear that, they sometimes think that those people are potentially in play. But actually, for the vast majority of people, making up your mind doesn't mean changing your mind.
Right.
It means simply going with what you were thinking at the start of the campaign. I think what we're seeing with this election is that, and it's worth pointing out that a lot of people still aren't paying as much attention as they're going to be even in the last week. So there is that. But I think for a lot of people, what's happening is that they were willing to give Rishi Sunak a chance. And I'm talking about historical Conservative voters here. They were willing to perhaps consider him, although they hadn't made their mind up. But then when they saw a succession of mistakes from Rishi Sunak, most obviously at the start, the coming home from D-Day, I think things like that just help to reinforce the problems. And then as you go along, we then have the issues around betting. And all of that helps to actually quell any kind of enthusiasm that otherwise Rishi Sunak might have been able to build up. Because when they're talking about that, they're not talking about things that actually attract voters to the Conservative Party.
Well, let's talk about some of those top election issues. I'm going to skip over leaders in the economy because that hasn't changed. Keir Starmer is still way ahead of Rishi Sunak. And generally on the economy, Labour continue to lead the Conservatives by some distance. But let's look at the top election issues, the top 5 most important issues ahead of the election facing individuals and their families.
Yeah, so that's the cost of living, which is ahead by some distance, followed
60%
by...
almost.
Yes, on 59% listed in their top 3. Then the NHS on 47%. Then the economy generally, 28%. Then immigration and asylum, and then pensions just below that. And a lot of concentration has been given to taxation by the Conservatives, I assume, as an attempt to address this issue around the cost of living, that they're making various claims about, this is how much more Labour will cost you if they're in government. The difficulty is that when you ask people who is best to deal with the cost of living, Labour win by some distance. The Conservatives have not really been able to find an argument that resonates particularly well with either their voters and particularly with the general electorate. And on the NHS, the Conservatives have always been on shaky ground there. And indeed, even in the debates and in the interviews that Rishi Sunak has given, he's been forced to say, yes, waiting lists are up. It hasn't gone as well as I would have liked. I would have liked to have ended the doctor strike, etc., etc. None of that is good. And so if you're on shaky ground on the top 2 issues, and no one is particularly convinced by you on immigration and asylum, then that's not a strong base from which to build a successful campaign.
And you've also got the top 5 most important issues ahead of the election facing the country. I'm sorry, what's the distinction between individuals and families and the country? Isn't the country made up of individuals and their families?
Well, yeah, only, not society, as someone once said. The reason is, to give it its geeky explanation, it's the distinction between sociotropic and egocentric
Okay, yeah.
questioning.
Big words for me.
In other words, we're getting people to think about what's most important to them and then what's most important to others and everyone else. And so a combination of these things, and it will vary from person to person, will determine what are the most important things when they come to vote.
Okay, so for the country,
it's the NHS that is top.
That's the top, yeah. Basically, NHS and cost of living swap places.
That's right, and that's it's only towards the end of the campaign that the NHS has moved ahead, and I think that's an interesting idea. And I think it's based on the amount of attention that Labour have given the NHS during the campaign. Often, health as an issue rises during an election campaign because it's such an emotive issue and people start talking about it and thinking about it.
And interesting that immigration and asylum is third when we look at the country, with 33% putting it as one of their top priorities.
And again, this is consistently something that we see in the data, that when you ask people what's the most important thing to them, it comes consistently lower. but when it's a problem for the country, but not for individuals. And that means that its power to motivate people is slightly reduced compared to something like the cost of living, which has support across both. That doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that in relative terms, other things are felt to be more important.
Now, Joe, you and I have had this conversation before, and I'd like to have it again. And I asked actually Adam and Kate earlier, and I think they take your point of view. And I'm not saying that I'm on one side or another, but I noticed that a lot of countries, when it comes to their polling days and a little bit of time before polling days, they don't allow national polls to be published. I think in Europe, one of the most extreme are Italy. It's prohibited to have any polling from the preceding day. But also, actually, they prohibit candidates from being named in their media for 15 days before polling. So quite a lot. But in France, 48 hours. In Greece, beg your pardon, 48 hours before. In France, 24 hours before. A lot of people have this ban on polling 24 to 48 hours before polling day. The idea being either people might look that there's a party well ahead, so they might as well not go out and vote because that party's guaranteed to win, or that they might sway their opinion one day or another. I have sort of dabbled with the opinion that perhaps polling may drive opinion rather than the other way around. You're vehemently, as a pollster, against that. But tell us a bit why you think that actually going for a 48-hour ban on polling, for example, is not a good idea.
Well, let's look at this in two ways, operationally and then the sort of philosophical democratic argument. Firstly, operationally. Well, I mean, and it is worth pointing out before we even do that we don't allow the publication of how people have voted.
Yes.
So we don't allow polls on that to be published. Only the exit poll is that. And so I, along with all other pollsters, won't make any kind of comment at all on polling day about anything. And indeed, the media is restricted on what it can say as well. And I would say quite rightly. But let's look at the operational side of things. And the first question is, at what point do you say, OK, we're going to stop polling? Because France and Italy, that you've both mentioned, have actually reduced the amount of time that the ban covered. Yeah. And let's say it was in place in this country, so we couldn't talk about the polls for the last 2 days, let's say. So on Monday, we have to stop talking about the polls.
Yeah.
Firstly, what difference is that going to make? Everyone's aware. Everyone who wants to be is aware of the polling. Anyone who wants to seek out what the polling is can look at it. It's just not up to date. It's just a day out of date or 2 days out of date. So what what benefit do you get from that? And then there's the idea of being able to actually ban polling. You can ban the publication of polling, but you can't really ban the polling taking place at all.
So private companies polling.
Well, from a commercial point of view, I would be absolutely delighted with a complete ban on political polling, because then I would conduct private polling for broadcasters, parties, commercial interests, everyone from financial institutions to everyone else. And I would sell the same poll again and again and again, and become extremely well off. And that would be.
See, I'm doing it for you.
And that would be lovely. But I don't support that, because I do believe that actually polling that is conducted to be accurate, intended to be accurate and representative, to accurately represent the views of the general public, is of benefit to the to the democratic process in this country. Because understanding what people think is a really important thing for understanding why politicians behave the way they do, why they do one thing over the other, why they make the decisions they do, and how you can respond to that.
Okay. I think you've sort of convinced me of this before. I get you convince me every 5 years, then I go unconvinced, then you bring me back.
But there are arguments on the other side, and I don't deny that. But there are arguments on the other side.
Okay. Well, that's the end of our polling extravaganza. I suppose it's going to be a big day for you guys on Thursday, because you get to find out whether you've been right all along.
Yes, but not till 10 o'clock. Not till 10 o'clock.
All right.
And then it's the exit poll, and then we see if the exit poll's right. So yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Joe, always a pleasure. I'm sure we'll be speaking next week to find out how we'll be marking your homework next week.
Can't wait.